This is a run through of a practice paper 3. It's suitable for Edexcel Economics A students and teachers. I've written this practice paper and you can find the full practice paper on my website. Just to show you quickly what the practice paper looks like, you've got one question on Europe, trading blocks, integration, unemployment, and the current account, also quantitative tightening, and then some questions 5, 8, 12, and the choice of 225 markers where you pick one. We'll go through all these questions in the video today. And similarly for question 2, this time this is about CEOs working from home and sandwich shops. Sandwich shops and city centres working from home, how CEOs are paid. And then again, some 5, 8, 12, and 25 mark questions. So the more practice you do, the better prepared you'll be for the exam, whether it's past paper questions, practice paper questions. The more questions you do and the more feedback you get on those questions, the better position you'll be in come the exams. So I've lifted the first question and the relevant part of the extract from that paper. The 5 mark question, the 1A, is explain the difference between primary income and secondary income in the current account. Refer to figure 1 in your answer. And figure 1 is this table that I've pasted in above here. Now, this is about primary income and secondary income, so we're going to be using these two parts of the table to get our application marks. Now, to answer the question, we're going to have a section on knowledge and analysis and a section on application. You can mix these up if you like. There's no particular order you need to do these in. But there are 3 marks for knowledge and analysis, typically. And this means we need to explain what net primary income is. It includes cross-border flows of interest, profit, and wages. And these are payments for the provision of factors of production, such as labour. Net secondary income includes cross-border flows of aid and remittances. And that involves redistributing income. So that's explaining our knowledge and that's explaining the terms, giving some examples of what might be in the primary and secondary income. Now, for the 2 marks for application, we're going to refer to the extract. Net primary income remained at 0.2% of GDP for the euro area in 2023 and 2024. That's a positive percentage, so it suggests more inflows than outflows of primary income. Net secondary income has marginally increased the percentage of GDP. It's become less negative, from minus 1.2% to minus 1.1% in the euro area from 2023 to 2024. That's our application, that's our knowledge analysis. Referring to Extract A, paragraph 1, examine 2 causes of unemployment in mainland Europe. This is the 8-mark question, and here's the extract section on this. So a few relevant points I pick out from this extract. I'm not going to read through the entire thing here, but the first thing is that it says that wage agreements are agreed for 2 years or more, with some agreements in Italy and Spain as long as 5 or 6 years. And this is because of the collective bargaining between trade unions and employers that can lock in wages for multiple years at a time. So that type of unemployment is real wage unemployment. That's going to be one of our points for our 8-mark question. Another part of the extract is about Bulgaria, its workforce lacking the skills required in today's job market. So that's going to be structural unemployment. That'll be our second point. Now, here's an optional diagram I'm going to zoom in on that you could use if you wanted. It is an 8-mark question, so you don't need a diagram unless it says explicitly in the question to add a diagram. So this would be like a minimum wage diagram, essentially, showing, well, the labour market, the supply of labour and demand for labour. And if that market were in equilibrium, well, the wage would be W1 and the level of employment would be Q1. However, if the inflexible wage set by the trade union is set at W2, above the free market equilibrium, then we'd have demand for labour at Q3 and supply of labour at Q2. We'd have this amount of unemployment caused by the wage being above the free market equilibrium. Now, when I talk through this point, I'm going to explain that diagram in words. You can draw it if you like, but you don't have to for this question in particular. So this is the answer. One cause of unemployment is real wage inflexibility. This means real wages cannot fall to bring the labour market into equilibrium. And this would be because of wages being stuck above the free market equilibrium wage, just like in our diagram we had earlier, due to wage agreements between trade unions and employers lasting as long as 5 or 6 years. That's our application. This may reduce demand for labour, that's a contraction, in other words, a movement along the demand curve for labour. And as a result, there'll be excess supply of labour. In other words, the unemployment rate rises, supply of labour exceeds demand for labour. Another cause is not having the skills for the jobs available, and that's known as occupational immobility, which is a type of structural unemployment. Some workers in Bulgaria lack the digital skills required in today's job market. Again, that's getting our application in from the extract. That could lower the demand for labour. If workers are less productive without the digital skills, that could reduce employment and increase unemployment. Now, there are 2 marks for evaluation in the 8-mark question. You can either do 2 short evaluation points or 1 explained evaluation point. So for this question, I've done 1 explained evaluation point. We'll see later on how you can do 2 shorter evaluation points for the second 8-mark question. So, however, government-funded training schemes for digital skills could give workers new skills that are in demand in the job market, and that would increase worker productivity, and it could reduce structural unemployment. So for the 5 and 8-mark question, I recommend trying to get through those relatively quickly because these are points-based questions. Using a diagram, discuss the effect of joining a common market, such as the European Union, on social welfare. Refer to extract A in your answers. This is the 12-mark question. Now, let's use extract A, the rest of extract A. I've reprinted it here in italics, and discuss how we can use this for our answer. One thing I want to draw your attention to immediately is this fact near the bottom. 63.6% of imports into France come from other EU member states, including car brands from Germany, such as Volkswagen. That's going to give us our first point, which is about trade creation. Now, that can be enough because we're going to have our diagram for analysis as well. So some other points we could use here for evaluation would be things like the common customs tariff, which is like the common external tariff that the EU puts on countries outside the EU. An example would be the average tariff rate of 42.2% for dairy. That's one of the highest tariff rates in the CCT. Also, that France is a net contributor to the EU's budget. That could be a relevant counterpoint as well. Okay, here's the answer. So, joining a common market such as the EU could reduce trade barriers, leading to trade creation. That's the argument we're going to make. For example, 63.6% of imports into France come from other EU member states. That's our application. Now we've got our diagram. So the diagram here is showing a fall in the tariff rate as if France is part of the EU, so it gets lower tariffs for trade, say, with Germany. And so what's that going to do? Well, let's explain the diagram. Having tariff-free access to these imports, such as the cars from Germany, such as Volkswagen, another use of the extract, shifts the world supply down from SW plus tariff down to SW. And this is for the French car market. That's going to reduce the price from PW plus T to PW, and that's going to mean there's more imports. So imports before were between Q2 and Q3. Imports after were between Q1 and Q4 once the tariff is eliminated. And as a result of this, there's an increase in consumer surplus. What I recommend for these tariff diagrams is using this A, B, C, D labeling. It's very simple and clean and very easy to execute in the exam. So in this case, consumer surplus is rising. So to begin with, consumers are consuming Q3 units at price PW plus T, and they're willing to pay the line in the demand curve, the price in the demand curve, but they actually get to buy it for the world price plus the tariff. And so their consumer surplus is this area here. But when the tariff falls, consumer surplus increases, consumers are consuming at Q4 and PW. They're willing to pay on the demand curve, but they actually pay the world price. So their consumer surplus has increased to this, and the increase is A plus B plus C plus D, this area here. So why is that? Why are consumers better off? The idea is there's more competition from imports, which is bringing down prices. Now, we can also analyze this diagram in terms of producer surplus and government revenue to work out the social welfare gain. So the idea is that producer surplus is going to fall by area A. That's because producers in France, to begin with, are producing a Q2 PW plus T, which means their producer surplus, the difference between what they're willing to sell for, the supply curve, and what they actually sell for, the world price plus the tariff, is this area here. But when the tariff is reduced, the production in France falls to Q1, and they're receiving price PW but willing to supply according to the supply curve. Therefore, the producer surplus has fallen into that smaller triangle. So the fall is area A. Similarly, the government revenue when the tariff was in place was the tariff per unit multiplied by the number of imports that are facing the tariff Q3 to Q2. And so that was the area C. But when the tariff is removed, the government loses that revenue source, so area C is eliminated. And that means when you add these things up, if you add up A plus B plus C plus D, consumer surplus gain, and you subtract the loss in producer surplus and government revenue, you get the increase in social welfare B plus D. So that'd be important for analysis as well. And I'll explain this in the text. So additional price competition results in overall welfare gain. There is B plus D, like we said. And that's because the rise in consumer surplus outweighs the fall in producer surplus and government revenue. I'm not dwelling too much on those points because they're negatives. I'm focusing more on the positives. But it's necessary just to briefly mention producer surplus and government revenue just to establish that social welfare gain is area B plus D. And now we can explain why each of those areas B and D represent welfare gains to society. So for area D, this is because consumers are consuming more units of the good, increasing consumer surplus. For area B, those units are produced whether the tariff exists or not, but those units are produced by a more efficient foreign producer, in this case Germany, once tariffs are removed. And that's reducing costs in a way that's passed on to consumers with lower prices. That's our analysis. We've done one long analysis point for the 12 marker. You could do two shorter analysis points if you like as well. Let's evaluate. So first evaluation point is about the common external tariff. There's this common custom tariff that you have to put in place if you join the EU. An example includes a 42.2% average tariff rate on dairy imported from outside the EU. That could increase the cost of importing. That could lead to higher prices and lower consumer surplus. Also, France is a net contributor to the EU budget, and so that could increase France's budget deficit, leading to higher government borrowing and debt interest payments rising. And that means the French government has less funds available to spend on other things like healthcare, and that could reduce health and social welfare. So you should choose from one of the 25 markers in the exam for question 1, but I'm going to go through both of them just to show you how you can do each question. So this question is, evaluate the microeconomic and macroeconomic advantages for a country of joining a monetary union. And here's the relevant part of the extract in italics. So just one thing to clear up first of all, is this idea that the euro area is different from the EU, the European Union. So the euro area includes countries that use the euro as their currency and share the ECB in charge of monetary policy. But the European Union is a common market without trade barriers between member states. And so some countries are members of the EU but not the euro area. So Denmark and Poland have their own currencies, but they're in the EU but not the euro area. And of course, when the UK was in the EU, it still had the pound its own currency. So here we're talking about countries that are part of the euro that have the euro as their currency. And some relevant parts from the extract would be, well, it talks about Bulgaria, one of the most recent countries to join the euro. 83% of imports into Bulgaria are paid for using euros. So Bulgaria is obviously quite interconnected with the euro area. And it also mentions this per-drop facility in Bulgaria is the largest copper refinery in southeastern Europe. And they import copper ores to be refined, and then they export copper out of the country once it's been refined and smelted. Some other relevant facts, maybe for evaluation, could be that 45% of Bulgaria's exports go to euro area countries. That's quite integrated, but also that means 55% of exports are going somewhere else outside the euro area. Conditions to join the euro may include that the actual fiscal deficit should not exceed 3% of GDP or the planned fiscal deficit as well. Here's our answer. We're going to start off with our microeconomic advantage. So one microeconomic advantage is higher profits. Let's first explain the concept in words before we get to the diagram. So the idea is that joining the monetary union means lower costs of currency conversion for businesses. Businesses do not have to pay transaction fees to a middleman to convert currencies between the leva and the euro. So let's take the example of this copper refinery that was mentioned in the extract. So this per-dot copper refinery does not have to pay currency conversion fees when it imports raw copper from the euro area, and does not have to pay currency conversion fees when it's exporting refined copper back to the euro area. And that's one of Bulgaria's main imports and exports. Now let's move on to the effect of that in terms of a diagram. So lower currency conversion costs, because you have to pay a middleman to convert between the lev and the euro, might mean lower marginal cost and lower average cost, and that's shown on the diagram here. So MC and AC are shifting downwards from MT to MC1 and AC to AC1. Now, what effect does that have on the diagram? Well, to begin with, the firm is producing where MC equals MR at Q1, and we can dot up to find the price, P1, and we can dot back down to find the average cost, C1. The profit is P1 minus C1 multiplied by Q1, which is this area here. Now, when the marginal and average costs fall, well, the firm still produces where MR equals MC1. That's this point here, if it's profit maximizing. That's output level Q2, so output has increased from Q1 to Q2. And the price has decreased to P2 when we go up to the AR line. And the average cost has fallen to C2. And so the profit is now P2 minus C2 multiplied by Q2, which is this area here. That area is larger, the supernormal profit has increased. And we've explained that in words in the text as well. So it reduces the price from P1 to P2, increases supernormal profit from P1 minus C1 Q1 to P2 minus C2 Q2. You can also label the areas using letters for each vertex, like A, B, D, E, etc. This makes firms more dynamically efficient, as firms can use their supernormal profit to invest back into the business, for example, in making the copper refinery process more efficient, which may bring down costs over time and further increase profit. So to summarize this paragraph, what I've done is I've explained in words why it would mean lower costs. I've explained the effect of lower costs in the diagram, and then I've explained the further beyond the diagram one other impact that might have, dynamic efficiency. Let's evaluate this point. So, however, currency conversion fees between lev and euro may only be a small portion of total costs for Bulgarian businesses as a typical evaluation point, proportion of costs. This is because, for example, the per dot facility may export to and import from other countries outside the euro. So joining the monetary union does not reduce currency conversion costs. So we can use that fact, or the opposite of the fact, from the extract. If 45% of Bulgaria's exports go to the euro area, and 55% of their exports go to non-euro countries. And so these costs may only be small percentages of costs in any case, with raw materials and labour likely to be larger costs. So as a result, the MC and AC may fall by a smaller extent, resulting only in a smaller increase in profits for companies. So the key point here is that proportion of total cost point as a key evaluation point. The macro advantage is increasing the economic growth rate and the employment rate. So why might monetary union increase the employment rate or growth rate? Well, first of all, let's explain part of the explanation in words. Monetary union makes it easier for consumers to compare prices in different countries, with more prices being denominated in euros. What denominator means is that when you go to a supermarket or anywhere else where you've got prices, the prices are written, expressed in euros. And so it's easier for consumers to compare prices. This increases competition between firms in different countries, forcing firms to cut costs by being more productive. And indeed, we can use that fact from earlier, 83% of Bulgarian imports come from the euro area. So monetary union could lead to more price transparency and competition between the imports from abroad and domestic products. Let's analyze the diagram now. So this diagram shows LRS shifting right to LRS1 and SRS shifting right to SRS1. So why is LRS shifting right, first of all? Well, productivity is increasing because of the extra competition. And we also mentioned there's cost cutting, so that's going to shift the SRS to the right. So altogether, that leads to real GDP increasing from Y1 to Y2 as we move from this equilibrium here to the new equilibrium here. And it also means the price level falls as well from PL1 to PL2. And I've extended the explanation further, the diagram. The fall in price level leads to an extension in aggregate demand. And one reason for that is that lower domestic prices will boost export competitiveness for goods such as wheat and oil, which are some of the exports mentioned in the extract for Bulgaria. Increasing export demand, which is a component of AD. As there is an extension in AD, there's an increase in derived demand for labour needed to produce the extra goods. And that means the unemployment rate falls. We're back to the point at the very start of the question. We've linked the macro objectives. So again, just to summarize this paragraph, we're saying there's more price transparency at the start, explaining why there is in words, but then explaining the diagram in words, and at the very end we're linking back to macro objectives, unemployment rate in particular, but also earlier on to economic growth. Let's evaluate this point. So however, joining a monetary union could slow the economic growth rate, so we're making a contrasting point. To join the euro area, countries have to meet conditions such as a maximum fiscal deficit of 3% of GDP from the extract. And that could require a reduction in government spending to achieve that. And because government spending is a component of AD could shift left. This could also reduce government spending on supply side policies such as education. And that would mean you'd have less human capital in your country because you have fewer skills being learnt. And that would shift LRS left, and that would reduce the equilibrium of real GDP in the economy and slow the rate of economic growth in contrast. Now, for the conclusion for the 25 markers, it's a good idea to try and argue which effect is more significant, the micro effect or the macro effect. And so in this case, I'm arguing that the macro effect of higher economic growth is likely to be larger in the longer term. And that's because, as I've argued at least, easier price comparison is likely to generate extra competition because there's a large fraction of Bulgarian imports that are coming from euro area countries as opposed to other countries outside the euro area. But in the short run, economic growth could be slower, downturns could be deeper because of the inability to increase government spending because of those 3% rules on fiscal policy. And also because of the lack of independent monetary policy being controlled by one central bank, the ECB. The microeconomic effect of lower costs is likely to be small because currency conversion costs are likely only a small proportion of total cost. Here's the other 25 marker. Evaluate the microeconomic and macroeconomic consequences of quantitative tightening. And here's the extract. So maybe a few relevant things to point out here is that, well, it mentions this 6.4% unemployment rate in the euro area. That could be relevant, maybe for discussing spare capacity, for example. You've also got this fact that ECB is reducing asset holdings by 15 billion euros a month. That's essentially what quantitative tightening is. Just to explain what this means, quantitative tightening from the extract. Essentially, it's the reverse, the opposite of quantitative easing. And so with QT, or quantitative tightening, the central bank is selling the bonds rather than buying the bonds that it bought under quantitative easing. Another part of this is that this could lead to tighter credit conditions in the euro area, making it more difficult for firms to fund capital expenditure. So that could be a point about reductions in investment as well. Also, it says part of the rationale is to help bring down inflation from its peak. So that could be a good macro effect to discuss too. Okay, here's our answer. We'll start with a macro effect this time. A macroeconomic effect is the fall in the rate of inflation. Now let's briefly explain how quantitative tightening lowers investment in words, and then we'll get to the diagram. Part of the reason for quantitative tightening from the extract was to help bring down inflation from its peak in 2022. Quantitative tightening, or QT as we can abbreviate it to, involves a central bank selling mainly government bonds to financial institutions, with the ECB reducing asset holdings by 15 billion euros a month. This reduces the amount of cash that financial institutions such as commercial banks have available to lend. And so commercial banks lend less funds, and so it's more difficult for firms to borrow money to invest. That might reduce investment. So we know that quantitative tightening may lead to a fall in investment. Let's now explain the fall in investment on the economy using a diagram. So investment is a component of AD. So if there's a fall in investment, it's going to shift AD left from AD1 to AD2. That's the first shift left in AD in the diagram here. At the same time, though, this could cause a negative multiplier effect. How do we explain that? Well, the fall in investment means firms selling capital goods have less revenue and profit. And so that means they cannot pay their workers as much, so their wages fall, and so consumption falls, shifting AD further left from AD2 to AD3. And that's shown in the second shift in this diagram here. That's a key thing to note about the multiplier effect. It's starting with a change in one of the injections, I, G, or X, leading to second round changes in consumption, which means that AD rises by or falls by an even greater extent than the initial change in AD. As a result of the two shifts in AD, real GDP falls from Y1 to Y3, and the price level falls from PL1 to PL3, as seen in the diagram here. This helps bring down the rate of inflation, closer to target, helping to achieve the macro objective. So again, we've explained the diagram for the macro point, and we've linked back to the macro objective. To evaluate this depends on the level of spare capacity. So the economy may have unused factors of production, which may be reflected in the unemployment rate in the euro area of 6.4% in April 2025. If there is a high level of spare capacity, this can make the LRIS perfectly price elastic at low levels of output. This can be shown in the diagram here. This is an optional diagram, as you don't necessarily need a diagram for the evaluation point, but it helps you to understand the point. This is the diagram. Now, if you have an AD shift to the left, when you're on this low elastic part of the Keynesian LRS, well, what happens? Well, real GDP falls quite significantly from Y1 to Y2, but the price level barely moves. So this means if you've got high spare capacity, if you're on a deep downturn, for instance, and you try to reduce AD by using quantitative tightening, you're not going to reduce inflation by much. And we've explained that point in words in the text. So this means it's easier for firms to change production levels in response to price changes if we're on the perfectly price elastic part of the LRS. And in this case, a shift left in AD does not reduce the price level, failing to bring down the rate of inflation. Now we're going to explain a microeconomic effect. This is a bit more complex. I'm going to take it step by step. So we mentioned that quantitative tightening involves central banks selling government bonds, maybe selling them to financial institutions. As a result, if you're increasing the supply of something, the price is going to fall in equilibrium. And one key thing is there's this inverse relationship between the price and the yield or the rate of return. The idea being that if the price is lower, the investors now have to pay less due to the lower price to receive the same coupon payments, the interest payments, if you like, which are fixed when the bond is first created. And that's why when the price falls, your rate of return on buying that bond increases. Now, if the rate of return for buying a bond increases, then there might be less demand for other types of bonds, corporate bonds. Investors would maybe buy more government bonds and buy fewer corporate bonds. That's going to mean a lower price. If there's less demand for something, it's lower price. And again, we get this inverse relationship between price and yield. There'll be a higher yield or higher rate of return for corporate bonds. And that means it's more costly for firms to borrow money. And that's explained in this paragraph here. And this attracts investors to invest more in government bonds, but that means they're less attracted to invest in maybe stocks or corporate bonds. Reduced demand for corporate bonds may lead to lower bond price and higher corporate bond yield, and that will make it more expensive for companies to borrow to invest, increasing interest costs for companies. And that's going to be our key way into the micro effect because we have higher interest costs for companies. And those could be seen as a fixed cost. And we can use the extract to say, well, companies may face tighter credit conditions as a result of quantitative tightening. Now, this diagram is therefore going to show an increase in average cost. So when you have an increase in a fixed cost, your average cost increases, but your marginal cost, the change in cost from changing the number of units you produce, is not going to be affected. So average cost shifts upwards from AC to AC1, as we explained in the text, and that makes it more difficult for firms to fund capital expenditure. That's another quote from the extract. And that could mean lower supernormal profit for, let's say, this Bulgarian copper refinery if it borrows money. And that supernormal profit falls from P1 minus C1 times Q to P1 minus C2 times Q, which is negative. So that means the firm is making a supernormal loss as a result. If average revenue is less than average cost, as it is in this case due to the rising cost, this can make firms shut down more likely in the long run. So again, I've extended the diagram and I've linked it to something else, in this case, firm shutdown. To evaluate this, we could say that commercial banks may have high confidence if they believe firms are likely to continue to grow in the euro area. And the extract does mention this high inflation in 2022. If that's caused by demand pull factors, to the extent it is, that could be a sign of high economic growth and growing business revenues. So the banks may continue to invest in companies, even if government bond yields appear more attractive. So companies may continue to have access to loans without higher interest costs, so profits may not fall. So quantitative tightening may not lead to firm shutdown. So this confidence point, a typical evaluation point. Let's conclude. So overall, the macro effect of lower inflation is likely to be larger than the micro effect of lower firm profits. And unemployment rates are 6.4%, but it's relatively low by historical standards. So the economy is likely near full capacity according to historical standards. So low spare capacity suggests that the quantitative tightening is likely to reduce inflation. Whether profits fall may depend on the industry, so maybe it's weaker effect in that sense. Some industries may require upfront capital investment, such as machinery and factories for refining copper in Bulgaria. That's the example of the firm we had in the extract. But other firms may invest using retained profit and may not see higher costs as a result from borrowing. Let's do question 2. So referring to extract C paragraph 1, explain one impact of a divorce of ownership from control. So this was the extract here. 2 bits to highlight. Close to 40% of shareholders voted against plans for the CEO's pay to rise at Centrica. And I should note there was an expected fall in profit in the first quarter of 2025. We'll use those facts in our 5-mark response. Okay, so 5 mark, let's get our knowledge and analysis marks. Divorce of ownership from control means managers and CEOs are managing the day-to-day operations, and they're different people from those who own the firm, the shareholders. Shareholders may want to maximize profit, while managers may want to maximize sales to improve their own reputation. And this results in sales maximization, which may reduce profits and dividends for shareholders. Okay, that's our knowledge and analysis. Let's get some application in there. 40% of shareholders voting against plans for the CEO's pay to rise at Centrica, and also that is expected fall in profits in the first quarter of 2025, and that may mean shareholders think the CEO is not maximizing profits. So we're linking the quotes back to our answer. Again, you can do this in any order, application, knowledge, analysis, mix them up. As long as you have those 2 relevant quotes from the extract for this 5-mark question, should be good. 8-mark question. Examine 2 possible reasons why maximum wage for CEOs may lead to government failure. Refer to extract C in your answer. So this is the relevant part of the extract in italics. And it says that the high pay center is calling for a maximum 10-to-1 pay ratio between bosses and lowest paid workers in the company. This is in effect a maximum wage for CEOs that linked to the lowest pay of the employee in the company. Now, 2 sources of government failure here. Well, one is that firms could choose to hire fewer workers, maybe getting rid of lower paid workers to meet the pay ratio, or firms may decide to move abroad to avoid the pay cap. Now, here's an optional diagram that I'll zoom in on briefly. This would show the effect of a maximum wage in a labour supply labour demand diagram. So W1 Q3, where labour supply meets labour demand, that would be where the market would be without the maximum wage. The maximum wage would be put in place below the free market equilibrium. That leads to supply of labour falling. You'd have fewer CEOs, and you'd have demand for labour increasing to Q2, meaning more demand for CEOs because they're cheaper relative to the wage they were being paid before. That could lead to this excess demand of CEOs between Q1 and Q2. That's optional. I'm going to explain it in words because the question doesn't necessarily ask for a diagram, but you should also draw it if it helps. So one possible reason for government failure is the relocation of companies, such as CEOs and businesses may decide to set up abroad to avoid this pay cap. That's using the application. So companies operated by CEOs may move their location abroad to avoid this maximum wage. And this may have the unintended consequence, that's a nice buzzword for government failure, one of the 4 types of government failure, of fewer firms in the UK, which may reduce demand for non-CEO workers, leading to higher unemployment. However, coordinating maximum wages with other economies may reduce the incentive for CEOs to move abroad. So that's a nice short evaluation point. Another possible reason is by distorting wage signals by lowering CEO wages to meet the maximum 10-to-1 pay ratio, there may be a contraction in CEO labour supply. So that's referring back to our maximum wage diagram we were discussing earlier. And that's because of the reduced incentive to work. At the same time, demand for CEOs may extend if they become cheaper. That result of excess demand for CEOs and underemployment of CEOs in the UK, too few CEOs being hired relative to the optimal level of CEOs in the supply and demand for labour where they intersect. However, companies may be incentivized to raise wages of lower paid workers instead of cutting CEO pay to meet the pay ratio cap. So this is a way to do the 8-mark where you've got 2 short evaluation points rather than 1 extended evaluation point. Using a supply and demand diagram, assess the impact of higher input costs for sandwich shops on consumer surplus and producer surplus. Refer to extract D in your answer. This is the 12-mark question. Here's the relevant part of extract D. So one thing to pull out is higher energy and food costs are squeezing margins for sandwich shops. Input prices are increasing for supermarkets, with the bread price increasing from 58p to 84p per 800 grams in supermarkets. So our diagram is going to be showing the supply shifting left because of higher food and energy costs. And so increase in the food energy costs for sandwich shops could increase a firm's cost of production. And we're using that example of white bread price increasing in the supermarkets. And that's going to reduce the incentive to supply because the costs are higher, so the profit margins are lower. That would shift supply of sandwiches left from S to S1, as in this diagram here, where it shifts left from S to S1. As a result, the equilibrium price rises from P1 to P2, and the equilibrium quantity falls from Q1 to Q2. Now let's talk about consumer and producer surplus. So consumer surplus is going to fall. So consumer surplus is the difference between what consumers are willing to pay and what they actually pay. They're willing to pay the price shown on the demand curve, but they actually pay P1 to begin with. So the consumer surplus is this area here. But when the price rises to P2, they're willing to pay the demand curve, but they only pay P2, so their consumer surplus has fallen, and it's fallen by this area in between. So consumer surplus has fallen from P1AB to P2FB. That's what we say in the answer. P1AB to P2FB, a fall of area P1AFP2. That's this area here, this trapezium. And why is consumer surplus falling? The idea is that consumers are worse off because sandwiches have become more expensive. So consumers cannot afford to buy as many sandwiches. Let's evaluate the consumer surplus point. So part of the increase in food costs could be because of firms switching to buying higher quality ingredients. That can improve the taste of sandwiches, a kind of measure of quality in the sandwich market. And so demand may not fall, so consumer utility may not fall if the higher costs are because of higher quality ingredients. Let's do producers next. So producers are worse off from higher input costs, as energy and food costs rising are squeezing margins. That supply shift left results in producer surplus falling. Let's go back to the diagram to show that. So producer surplus starts off the difference between what they're actually receiving, P1, and the price they're willing to receive to produce the good, the supply curve. So this triangle here, P1AC, is producer surplus originally. But then the price rises to P2 and the quantity falls to Q2. So producers are willing to receive the price on the supply curve, but they actually receive price P2, so producer surplus has fallen. This triangle has a smaller width and a smaller height. So therefore, it's going to be a smaller producer surplus compared to the original larger triangle. Why is this? This is because higher input costs eat into profit margins, making producers of sandwiches worse off. So firms can only pass on some of the costs to consumers with higher prices, so that demand does not fall so much. Think about it like this, right? So if firms pass on the entire cost to consumers, then maybe demand might fall a lot and firms may lose more profit than they would if they only pass on some of the cost. So costs may increase by more than revenues from this price rise, and that means profits would fall. However, demand may be price inelastic if people visit the same sandwich shop out of habit, and so the firm could pass on most of the extra costs to consumers by raising prices, and that could reduce the extent to which producer surplus and profits fall. This is the first of 225 markers for question 2. In the exam, of course, you only have to pick one of the two. I'm going to go through both of them again. So evaluate the microeconomic and macroeconomic factors leading to pay gaps between CEOs and other workers. This is a factors or causes question, so it's a bit tougher than the consequences questions. You have to think about everything linking back to the pay gap between CEOs and other workers at the end. Here's the extract, and there are a few relevant points I pick out from it. It mentions there might be a small pool of qualified leaders, and so that could be an interesting point about the qualifications of a CEO. An idea of these increasingly complex organizations, the ability of a good CEO may matter more than ever. There's also this global competition for talent. That's giving me an idea of maybe a macro point about globalization. And there's this interesting evaluation point that maybe it might be based on connections rather than skills. So that could be a good evaluation for qualifications or skills. There are also some other parts of the extract that we might use here as well, but that's the main bit. Also note there's this table in the extract as well, comparing CEO and median full-time worker pay. We may use these facts. If you haven't got a fact we can use this as well. So let's explain the micro factor. And I'm going to split this argument into 3 steps. I'm first going to explain why labor demand might be higher for CEOs because of skills. I'm also going to explain what might happen to labor supply if there are these skill differences or a small pool of qualified leaders. And if you have time, I'm going to add this extra point about the wage mechanism to explain why wages rise for CEOs relative to the workers. Okay, so the micro factor is the difference in skills, and these CEOs may have extra management training or education, or maybe they've learned these management skills from experience, and that makes them more productive, leading to high demand for labor compared to other workers. So labor demand would shift right. So in this diagram below, labor demand is going to be higher for CEOs, it's going to shift right, compared to other workers. Now, at the same time, the education and experience required to be a CEO may only leave a small pool of qualified leaders available for the CEO role, using the extract there. Note. As a result, labour supply shifts left and becomes more wage inelastic for CEOs, rotating from SL to SL1. If there's a small pool of qualified leaders, then you need to raise the wage a lot more to generate an extra increase in labour supply to find an extra worker to come to your firm. This results in a higher equilibrium wage for CEOs, at W2 compared to the wage for workers at W1. See this in the diagram. So you've got supply of labour falling and becoming more wage inelastic. And so the wage for CEOs is higher at W2 compared to the wage for other workers at W1. Now, we can also use this opportunity to explain why the wage has to rise for CEOs as a result of skill differences. And at the original wage for other workers, there would be excess demand for CEOs, and so the wage mechanism, same thing as the price mechanism in a sense, steps in to eliminate the excess demand. Wages increase above W1 to incentivize more CEOs to supply labor, and to ration demand, so to force some firms that don't really need CEOs to reduce their demand, until CEO labor supply meets demand at a higher wage. And this could explain why CEOs in the UK are paid 4.58 million a year on average, compared to £39,039 for the median worker in the UK. That's the diagram we were talking about before. So CEOs being more skilled may increase demand for labor, and having a small pool of skilled workers because of the skill requirements, the qualifications that may be needed, may make labor supply more wage inelastic and reduce it. And that means higher wages overall for CEOs. To evaluate this point, there may not be a large difference in skills between CEOs and other workers. Instead, maybe it's about connections rather than skills. And this would mean there may not be some magical extra training that makes CEOs more productive than other workers, but workers may be rewarded for who they know, their connections, rather than their productivity. And maybe this could occur because company boards may lack information about productivity of employees, and so they rely on connections, references, if you will, to refer potential CEOs, or because of some non-meritocratic company culture where people aren't rewarded based on their productivity. So labour demand may not be higher for CEOs due to extra training, so maybe it's not training differences that explain the wage gap, or skill differences. A macro factor behind higher CEO pay relative to their workers is globalization. I'm going to split this argument into 3 bits. I'm not going to use a diagram for this point, but you're very welcome to use a diagram like the Lorenz curve, for example, for this. Here are 3 points you can make. So first of all, globalization involves offshoring. So taking your factory and moving it abroad. That means higher profits for the company. That means the CEO may get higher dividends as part of their pay from those profits. Also, with globalization, you have parts of your company in different parts of the world. That means the organization is more complex. That means there's more demand for CEOs to organize and coordinate all those different parts of the firm. Also, there's this idea that offshoring would lower wages for other workers because it would replace workers, let's say in the UK, by cheaper labor abroad. Let's go through it in more detail. So, globalization may mean multinationals offshore parts of their production process to the countries with lower labor costs. So that reduces costs for the company, increasing profits. That gives more funds for dividends for shareholders. And so the CEO, if they're paid in terms of company shares, such as these long-term incentive payments mentioned in part of the extract, then they can also receive higher dividends. They would effectively be shareholders themselves. Globalization could also increase the complexity of the firm's operations because of the multiple factories in different countries. And that means the ability of the CEO may matter even more in managing increasingly complex organizations. The returns to skill are increasing, if you will. And so that could increase demand for senior managers like CEOs to organize and coordinate different parts of the firm. Shift right in labor demand would result, and that might lead to higher wages for CEOs. But for other workers, globalization may lead to firms reducing demand for junior employees due to the offshoring, replacing workers in the UK with cheaper workers in factories abroad. So demand for junior employees would shift left, leading to lower equivalent wages for this group, creating this wage gap between CEOs and other workers. I've split this into three mini paragraphs for easier reading, but you can write it as one large paragraph in the exam. And if you only get two of these 3 points down in time, that would also be reasonable. However, globalization is also associated with an increase in labor mobility between countries, and this would have a contrasting effect compared to the increase in labor demand. So globalization may make it easier for UK firms to source CEOs from other countries because of greater migration flows and more remote working. For example, UK university graduates work 1.8 days a week from home on average. That's from another part of the extract that we'll see shortly. This can make CEO supply increase and become more wage elastic because of the larger pool of more qualified candidates available. And that could kind of cancel out the effect of higher labor demand. So higher labor demand can be cancelled out by higher labor supply, meaning that globalization may not necessarily lead to higher wages for CEOs. Conclusion. Overall, the microeconomic cause of differences in training and education is likely to be more significant than the macro cause of globalization, indeed that wage gap between CEOs and other workers, I'll argue. So globalization increases labor demand, but also labor supply. So that means there could be a neutral effect overall on CEO wages. Meanwhile, differences in educational training are likely to drive CEO wages up relative to other workers. And it's going to be difficult to retrain people to become senior managers through, say, government retraining schemes because CEOs have decades of training with their studies and experience. And so it's going to take a long time to retrain workers. This does depend on the firm, though. As mentioned before, some firms may hire based on connections rather than a worker's abilities. The final 25 marker in this paper is evaluate the microeconomic and macroeconomic consequences of more workers working from home. So the extract mentions some things about working from home. The first thing to draw attention to is the sandwich shops in London may not have the training they once had. There's also this fact about 1.8 days a week. So the number of days people are working from home in the UK, at least among university graduates, that's the highest among European countries in the survey. An important point is that working from home may enable workers to look for work who otherwise could not. So maybe this includes carers, parents, and people with certain disabilities. And that could be an increase in labour supply, and that could be an LRIS effect. So that's an interesting macro point, perhaps. Maybe a good evaluation point also is that workers may spread their consumption throughout the country. And so maybe some sandwich shops will lose out, but maybe some others will gain from working from home. So the microeconomic effect is lower profit for sandwich shops. So we're going to first explain why demand falls. So why does demand fall? This could be because workers spend less time in city centres and more time in their home area or at home. And indeed, the extract mentions this. Sandwich shops in London may not have the trade they once had. And now I'm going to explain the diagram. So the diagram is going to show AR and MR shifting to the left. Let's go to the diagram. So less demand for sandwiches in sandwich shops means MR and AR will shift left from AR to AR1, MR to MR1. Now let's see what happens to the price and output. So output originally was where MR equals MC, so that's Q1. We dot up to the price AR line to get the price P1. And we dot back down to average cost to get the cost per unit C1. So the profit is P1 minus C1 multiplied by Q1. This area here. Now, when MR and AR shift left, well, profit maximization occurs where MC equals MR1, this point here, that's output level Q2. Again, we dot up to the new AR line to give us the price, P2. So the price has fallen, and the quantity of the output has fallen as well. And we dot down to get the average cost, C2. So the supernormal profit, P2 minus C2 times by Q2 is now smaller. That's fallen as well. Let's get back to the commentary in the first paragraph. So this says exactly what we just said. MR and AR shift downwards to MR1 and AR1, reduces the price of sandwiches from P1 to P2, and the output reduces as well from Q1 to Q2. Supernormal profit falls by the areas we just described. This makes the sandwich shop less able to benefit from dynamic efficiency. After the diagram, we'll then explain the link to dynamic efficiency. So this makes the sandwich shop less able to benefit from dynamic efficiency. This means it has less supernormal profit to invest in making sandwich production line more efficient, so the cost of producing sandwiches may not fall over time. Also could have an effect on quality of sandwiches. Sandwich shops may not have the funds to invest in improving the quality of their food over time, such as better quality ingredients as well. To evaluate this, the redistribution of consumption around the country means sandwich shops in rural locations or locations outside major cities may benefit because workers are spending more time in the local area and they're more likely to come across and use these local sandwich shops. So they'd see increased demand, higher ARMR, higher profits, and more dynamic efficiency. A macro effect of more people working from home could be higher economic growth. So university graduates in the UK worked 1.8 days a week from home on average using the extract. And so let's explain why labour supply increases due to working from home. There are two ways this might happen. Working from home may reduce the geographical immobility of labour because workers don't need to be in commuting distance of a job to work at a company where they could work remotely instead. So you can imagine someone living in Scotland rather than having to commute to London. And that gives firms in London more choice about where they hire from. Working from home also enables more workers to enter the labour force who have other responsibilities to manage, such as these carers, parents, and people with certain disabilities that are mentioned in the extract. And those responsibilities might otherwise make it difficult to work full-time in the office. So this is going to shift LRAS to the right. If you have an increase in the quantity of a factor production, like labour supply, LRAS shifts right. That lowers the price level in equilibrium from PL1 to PL2 and increases real GDP from Y1 to Y2. This also causes an extension in AD to move from the original equilibrium to new equilibrium. That's explained in the text as well. So we explain the diagram as we've just done. And we explain why there's an extension in AD. Another way to explain this is that the falling price level gives workers more purchasing power, so it increases consumption at a given wage. And the key point is that we wanted to make is that it leads to economic growth, so we make sure we link to the macro objective here. To evaluate this, working from home could reduce innovation. With extra barriers of communication from screens and distance compared to sitting next to each other, this could make it harder for some staff to learn on the job and to innovate and communicate. And this could slow the growth rate of human capital and the rate of technological progress, and it could actually reduce productivity compared to a world without working from home. And that could shift LRS left and slow the UK the long-run economic growth rate. Let's conclude. So overall, the macro effect of working from home from higher economic growth is likely to be large. There may be conflicting effects on productivity, such as less distraction at home versus less innovation through collaboration. The effect on labour supply is likely to be significant, bringing more workers into the labour force. Given that UK university graduates work from home more than other European countries, the increase in labour supply could be much larger for the UK than for other European countries. The micro effect of lower profit is less significant for chain sandwich shops, which have locations across the country. And while some of the shops in the chain will lose out in the city centre, other sandwich shops in the chain will gain more customers and higher profits where they're outside the big cities with lots of offices, balancing out the effects on profits of these chains. Thank you very much for watching. For more practice questions, model answers and notes, feel free to check out my website, tfurther.com. Links are in the description, and comment below if you have any questions. Thanks for listening.